Hello, this is Stephen Garrett from the University of Findlay, and today I wanted to share a little bit more information about the research that I conducted on computer-based assessments versus paper-based assessments. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of the research that was being conducted, I wanted to explain a little bit about why this is such a relevant issue. And I think everyone would agree that computer-based assessments are something that within the public school setting are used on a very, very common basis, especially when things like Ohio standardized tests are required to be done on a computer in many schools across the state. For me, also within the school where I teach, our school recently moved to a one-to-one middle school, meaning that each student had access to their own Chromebook that they could use for school. And part of the meaning behind that was that perhaps teachers could implement more computer-based assessments to use with the students' Chromebooks that they had available. And also the research that I wish to conduct had to do with the achievement that computer-based assessments could be impacting. And I want to know, was there an impact when students take computer-based assessments compared to when they take them on paper? And no matter what, I was hoping that the research I conducted would be something new, but would also fit in with a larger body of research that has already been conducted in regards to computer-based assessments. Now, for my particular study, my problem statement was that the purpose of this study was to evaluate whether 7th grade students who took a computer-based assessment will perform adversely in terms of achievement to 7th grade students who take a paper-based assessment with identical questions and criteria. The hypothesis is very similar to that, sharing that 7th grade students who take a computer-based assessment will show significantly lower levels of social studies achievement to 7th grade students who take a paper-based assessment with identical questions and grading criteria. Now, you might be wondering, why does the hypothesis and problem statement, why do they show that computer-based assessments would have significantly lower achievement levels compared to paper-based assessments? And the reason for that was because of my mindset before this study was conducted. Whenever I issued a computer-based assessment in my classroom, oftentimes students would be upset, oftentimes complaining and worried that their scores were going to be lower because they're taking a test on the computer and not on paper. So that was the mindset I had, and I was willing to study that through the research that I conducted. Now, with that being said, there's an independent and dependent variable to this particular study. The independent variable would be the 7th grade students who are taking the computer-based assessments. These are all 7th graders who really were enrolled in my social studies class in that given year at the school where I teach. And then the computer-based assessment refers to the assessment that they were going to take using Google Forms that assesses a topic that was previously covered during the course of a teaching unit. So in other words, they were given the assessment, the computer-based assessment, after they had learned about a particular topic. Now, for the dependent variable, that would be the achievement. And as the hypothesis suggested, lower levels of student achievement compared to the students who took the same test on paper in terms of identical questions and grading criteria. So student achievement is really their percentage of how well they do on the assessment. And then the 7th grade students refer to those participants that were really students of my classroom at school. Before I could really get into conducting a lot of my own research, I wanted to see a lot of what was already out there in the body of research regarding computer-based assessment. What I found out is that there are really leagues and leagues of different types of formative assessment out there, and many researchers would suggest advantages to those as well. So for example, for formative assessments, Bellini suggested that students have many attempts to improve upon their achievement when they take computer-based assessments, so they can do retakes and try to improve their score. Also, gaming formative assessments are out there. Blogs can be used, such as WordPress, and also being able to track student progress and offer reflection for students. And then the last bullet point down here believes that computer-based assessments for standardized testing have increased rapidly. So in other words, the number of computer-based assessments that are out there have been increasing dramatically, even really, in my opinion, since 2003. So many types of formative and summative assessment available, and many researchers would suggest that computer-based assessments offer benefits that even perhaps paper-based assessments cannot in terms of student achievement. So as the first one bullet point suggests, computer-based assessments can enrich student learning in a high school science class through a study that was conducted. Even in math classes, in the second bullet point, computer-based assessment, students who took those generally showed gains in learning. Also, immediate feedback is a huge advantage of computer-based assessments and providing solutions and techniques into improving answers that were gotten wrong. Lastly, blogging offers a great deal of collaboration as well as critical thinking and analytical thinking, and this could be used as its own form of assessment as well. Now, through the body of research, you could find a ton of benefits to computer-based assessments, but there are also a great deal of negatives that have been suggested as well by research that has been conducted, not the least of which would be computer anxiety or fear that when taking computer-based assessments could lead to poor responses, misjudgments, and a slowing down of working memory in students' brains. Secondly, implementing a lot of these computer-based assessments requires a lot of special training, especially if you want a more advanced form of summative computer-based assessment. And this is going to come at a cost to school systems as well. Thirdly, it's very difficult with computer-based assessments to provide high-quality feedback. So although on a multiple-choice test, a student might automatically know their score and the ones they got wrong, it still doesn't allow for high-quality feedback and maybe more personalized information from a teacher that you would hope would come easier in paper-based assessments. Then the fourth bullet point, Bellini suggested that computer-based tests might even be more tiring for students to do compared to a similar length of a paper-based assessment. And lastly, research like Ricketts and Wilkes, which suggests that students actually perform at a higher level when they take a test on paper compared to when they would on a computer-based assessment, which is really fitting into the hypothesis that I created for this study. Now, for my particular study, there were 84 participants who took part in the quantitative study. Like I said, those were essentially just students in my classroom. This was done by convenience sampling for sure. Among those students, 40 were female, 44 were male. They're all between the ages of 12 and 14, and they all did the experiment within my classroom. Our school's enrollment is around 1,200 students. And there was a period of instruction where they were taught, and then the instrument or the assessment was provided afterwards, which more detail will be provided on that here in a little bit. And also the research, both anonymous and confidential. I was not going to be releasing student names or their performance out to the public about specifically how each student did. Also for the assessment, the instrument itself, a little bit more detail about that. I divided groups into a control group and an experimental group. There were 44 participants in the control group, and those were students who took the paper-based assessment. And in the experimental group, there were 40 students who completed the computer-based assessment Google Forms. All the participants went through a learning teaching segment, so they were taught a unit before they took their assessment. Also, both assessments, whether in the control group or experimental group, offer the same questions in the same order. And there are 14 multiple choice and 2 extended response questions. And then lastly, remembering the hypothesis, all of this experiment was done to try to determine whether or not student achievement is differing based on if students take an assessment on paper or on the computer. And for the procedures here, remember there was a learning segment that was going to be taught before the assessment was given. This instruction took place over 4 days, 55-minute class periods, and all of this was done within the classroom. And once the learning segment was done, then the participants could complete the post-assessment, whether in the control group or the experimental group. And then they had all the time that they needed within a given class period to complete the assessment. And then later I could use the results of this data that was collected through their performance on the assessments to analyze them and try to determine the meaning behind it as well. And I used Google Forms, Excel, Microsoft Word, and different programs to assist with that. And what I was able to find is that based on the results of this given study, there was not a major or significant difference in student achievement depending on if participants took the assessment on the computer or on paper. So my hypothesis was actually wrong in that way, or not true, because there wasn't a significant difference. And this can be shown here looking at the average assessment scores among the control group, which would be the paper-based assessment on the right, and the experimental group, which was the computer-based assessment on the left. And as you can see, very insignificant. Their averages were within 1 percentage point. So really very close in their overall average scores. Also, when you break down each individual question, so here the assessment, remember they had identical questions in the same order. There were 16 questions total. And ultimately, there was really not huge differences in most of the questions that were on this assessment between the control group and experimental group. The biggest discrepancy came in question 4, where there's an average difference of 7%. And paper-based assessment did score better, significantly better. However, when you look at the average of all the questions, 9 out of the 16 questions, students who took the assessment on the computer, they actually did better. So what I'm trying to say is when you break all this down, it's really a wash, and there's not really a significant difference between the control group and experimental group. This was also seen in things like the median and standard deviation, almost identical in both sets. So it was good to know, like for the standard deviation, that there wasn't a huge difference from the average mean in how students were performing. It's relatively small and extremely comparable to or between the control group and experimental group. So what did my findings say about computer-based assessments as a whole? Well, like I suggested, I do think this study fits in with all of the other research that had been done. I think that teachers such as myself should feel confident about implementing computer-based assessments in the future. In fact, as a result of the research that I've conducted, now all of my quizzes and tests in my class are done on the computer for some of those benefits that were suggested in my research. Having said that, I do think that more research needs to be done on this particular topic. My research had a ton of validity issues. For example, the convenience sampling, perhaps a study with more participants coming from different schools and different socioeconomic classes would be beneficial. And also maybe doing a more longitudinal study, long term, as opposed to just looking at one assessment and what the averages and how they lied out. So by changing those things, by varying those things, it would add a whole lot to the body of research that's out there and be able to hopefully back up the results of the research that I conducted in this study. So here are my works cited, the sources that I used for this presentation. But there's going to be a lot more sources that were used overall in the paper that I completed as a requirement for this class as well. But otherwise, I want to thank you for listening to this presentation, and hopefully you feel a lot more confident about using computer-based assessments within a classroom.